Thank you, Madam President, and thank you again for those responses. I would just argue that we're here to make public policy decisions that affect our state. And the mere fact that this is before us means that someone has an idea or a plan for implementing early voting. Otherwise, there would be no desire to put forward a resolution to change our Constitution to allow it. So I find it interesting that there is no detail about what the plan might ultimately be, and that's my greatest concern about this legislation that is before us. I'm going to speak only for a few minutes, but the main thrust of what I want to get across to people during this conversation is that there is the desire to increase access to voting. But I want to point out that is shared by everyone in this chamber. No one wants to limit people's ability to cast a vote in our elections. But at the same time that you increase access, you also have to be mindful of the process by which you do it to maintain the integrity, the sanctity, if you will, of our elections. Because if we do not have elections that are honest and decent, and the people who vote in those elections can rely on them, then the value of those elections and the value of our system of government is in danger. And that is my greatest concern. This proposal is extremely broad. The original proposal allowed for only 3 days of early voting. There are some people in this room that will vote no today when they might have considered voting for 3 days, simply because this allows for an unlimited period of time. There is no specification here. I don't mean to be ridiculous, but there's nothing stopping it from being the day after the previous election. 2 years in advance of another one. Maybe 4 years in the case of a gubernatorial election. Now, I don't think that would ever happen. But that is not the kind of language that we should be putting in our state constitution, in my mind. And what is the plan? If we institute early voting in this state, does that mean that we are going to require people to show up at a town hall location? And if we have happened in Connecticut, what we've seen in other states where a great many people participate, I don't think that's going to work for very long. Our town clerks will be overwhelmed. How will the votes actually be processed? Will they be done through an absentee process using the applications and envelopes and all that we use now? Or are they going to be done through a voting machine? And then you have the problem of the way our voting machines work in this state, which is that at the end of the day of voting, you shut off the machine and you have a tally. If you're doing that on a day-to-day basis, for 2 days, 3 days, 7 days, or 30 days, you're going to have numbers in someone's possession that are relevant and I think may affect the outcome of the election. As I said, this is a fundamental change to the way we do things. I know that other states have passed various forms of early voting, and I think that the results of those states' experience varies wildly. We had quite a bit of testimony in the committee on this, but the most detailed testimony that we heard was from Dr. Gail Alberta, who is an assistant professor of politics and public administration at Fairfield University. Somebody with some actual credibility who understands elections and has done a tremendous amount of research on this subject. And I've got her whole testimony in front of me. I'm certainly not going to go through the whole thing. But it was very interesting what she pointed out, which is what happens when you have different types of early voting and what the results are. And just to quote her, she said, on the other hand, early voting laws depress voter turnout, fail to increase representation, and alter the nature of campaigns. And I think you can see why each of those things actually happens. And certainly the last one. The nature of campaigns is that Election Day happens on a specific point in time. And each of us that serve in this chamber have all been involved in campaigns, and we realize that we have a timeline that we are working on, and we are running a campaign basically to lead up to that day, that final day where the people have the information necessary to cast a vote. If you go on to read her testimony, I think what you find out is that the people that vote early are the people that are not waiting for that information. They're people that have already made a decision. They're people that are partisan Republicans or partisan Democrats, and they simply want to get their vote cast and counted because they're anxious to do so. I don't think that increases quality participation in voting, which I think is even more important than the numbers. I think what we need to have is informed voters who are able to make a legitimate choice based on the things that are before them. I'll just point out that over the last 10 years, I cannot remember an election that went smoothly in this state. You had the first Malloy-Foley election that happened back, I think, in 2011. And there were plenty of irregularities that were pointed out, particularly in the city of Bridgeport. And I don't remember the exact details, but that's not what's important anyway. What's important is that there was confusion, and there were people that felt like they were disenfranchised, and that felt that that election was not done in a way where they could rely on the results being accurate. That is the worst possible outcome for an election. This is not a third world country. This is Connecticut inside the United States of America. Our elections have to be accurate, they have to have integrity, and no one can doubt the results. Since then, there have been countless other issues with polling places that did not close at the proper time, people standing in line after the time of voting, people being sworn in masse. These are things that should not happen in our election process. And in recent years, we have expanded our election process dramatically. I don't actually believe that there's anyone out there that's being disenfranchised from being able to vote under our current law. Election day is 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., and we have a process where if someone is unable to vote during that period, they can cast an absentee ballot, which is readily available to anyone who is a citizen and eligible voter in this state, and they can do that up to 45 days before election. So we already have a mechanism for early voting for those people that need it. We also have something that was instituted in the last several years called Election Day registration. And this, I think, is the source of the latest batch of problems that we've had, because we did not account as a state for how people would react to Election Day registration and voting. And I think in many cases, it was underestimated how many people would participate, leading to problems where people were not able to vote prior to 8 p.m., where the folks that were running those polling locations were overwhelmed and unable to provide the proper service, and people waiting in line. These are all significant problems that we should be addressing in this legislative session. And yet, those things are not being addressed. We are simply coming up with more ways to confuse the process. What happens to the scenario I mentioned earlier when the end of the night, the machine is shut off? Who's going to have that information about the day's tally? Or are we going to avoid that altogether and we're not going to feed the ballots through the machine that day? We're just going to put them in a bag and set them aside. Can you imagine what the news is going to say when you have towns all across our state holding bags of ballots waited to be tallied on a later date? Again, the issue is not that anyone wants to limit access. The issue is that we have to maintain the integrity of the vote. There are ways to do that, by the way. Continuing on with the testimony that Dr. Alberta put before us, she mentioned that there are better ways to provide for access. She mentioned that the biggest issue with people being able to vote is to actually know what they're voting for, who they're voting for, and where they are voting. And these are things we can do in this General Assembly. We could do some of these things even this session if we work hard on it, and they do not need to be made part of our state constitution. She recommended providing sample ballots to voters in advance of the election so that they know exactly what they're walking into without being confused by the ballot when they get there. She mentioned making sure that people are fully aware of where their polling location is so they're not confused on election day. I think those are great ideas to provide access, and I think we should explore them. I'll just finish up by saying that I don't know how this vote is going to turn out today, but one thing I do know is that if we do early voting without a plan, it is only going to lead to more problems than we have now, and potentially more disenfranchisement of voters. We need to get our house in order. We need to make sure that the problems that we have experienced over the last 10 years, I don't think we've had an election without problems. We need to get that fixed first. If we cannot fix that process, if we cannot fix the absentee ballot process that makes the news even today, we should not be expanding the ways to vote in this state without the resources and the information necessary to do so. And one of the other things that I think that we ought to be doing to maintain the sincerity and integrity of the vote and giving people the faith in our system of elections that it's actually working is to require photo identification at the polling location when people vote in person. And seeing that, Madam President, the clerk has an amendment. It's LCO 8194. Can you have him call it and I be allowed to summarize?
Yes, Mr. Clerk, please proceed.
LCO number 8194, Senate Schedule A.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Mr. Clerk, for reading that. This is a very, very simple amendment that we would make as a different change to our state constitution, and it would restore the integrity of elections in a lot of people's eyes, including my own. And it's simply language that would be added in Article 9 that says, any such elector who wishes to vote in person on the day of Election Day may do so only upon the presentation of current and valid photo identification containing the name and address of such elector. I move adoption, Madam President, and I'd ask that when the vote is taken, it be taken by roll.